Hi everyone, welcome. So great to see so many familiar faces. Most of you, I think, know me, but some of you might not. My name is Brendan Nielsen. I'm the Executive Director of the Anglican Diocese of Islands and Inlets and the co-chair of the John Albert Hall Lecture Series. To begin, we want to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous lands. UVic stands on Lekwungen territory, and we acknowledge the Songhees, Esquimalt, the Husepsim, and Saanich people who have lived in relationship with this territory forever, for thousands of years. Just down the road, of course, is Pecoles, and Pecoles is one of the places that one of the Douglas treaties was signed. As I've done quite a bit of reading and understanding, those treaties were quite unfair in a lot of ways. And as those treaties were being signed, at the same time as our organization as a diocese was receiving land grants and really easy access to prime lands all across these islands and inlets. And so we are on this constant journey of reconciliation, of truth-telling and repair. And this next leg of the journey for us, as some of you have heard me talk about before, is involving moving from symbolic signs of reconciliation to more structural signs of reconciliation. And if you're interested in what that's looking like for us, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. The John Albert Hall Lecture Series is the result of a gift from John Albert Hall, who many, many years ago saw the shift in these lands of the significance of religion here on the West Coast and wanted to ensure that the conversation remained important for us as lay people and clergy in our diocese and part of the cathedral to reflect and continue learning about what that might mean for us. And so the CSRS and the diocese for nearly 30 years have been putting these on together, and it's been a partnership where we get to explore our mutual interests and follow where those questions go. Today's lecture will be the final one in the kind of long-term partnership, and I want to extend personal thank yous to members of the steering committee. Some of you are here, both past and present, and to Rachel and to Paul before her and the CSRS staff who have really made these lectures so great for so many years. The John Albert Hall Lectures will continue, and there will be an event in May around homelessness, so look for information about that in the coming months. But I think that's enough from me, so I'll turn it over to Rachel to introduce the lecturer, Sarah, for tonight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Brown, and I am the new director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. And I'm so thrilled to be here to introduce you to our speaker for this evening, Dr. Sarah Kathleen Johnson. I'm truly honored to be able to act as moderator today for this event, not only in my role as director of the CSRS, as we bring our long and fruitful collaboration with the Anglican Diocese of Islands and Inlets on the John Albert Hall series to a close, but also as a longtime friend of Sarah. I have watched Sarah's research unfold over many years. In fact, one might say that I saw the beginnings of this book in the early days of knowing her as undergrads together in the UWaterloo Religious Studies program. Sarah and I took many of our classes together, and we were roommates on a study abroad program in Prague, always encouraging one another to be the absolute best religious studies students we could be. She understood my level of religious studies nerddom in a way that no one else did. And even from those early days in the early 2000s of Waterloo, I knew that Sarah would go on to conduct meaningful and impactful research and make a significant mark on the Canadian religious studies field. And so it is an especially significant privilege to have her here as our final John Albert Hall lecturer with the CSRS in my first year as director of the center. So now let me turn to a more formal introduction of Sarah. Dr. Sarah Kathleen Johnson is Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Pastoral Theology, the Director of Undergraduate Studies, and Director of Anglican Studies at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Ontario. She is a practical theologian who studies Christian worship in the context of a changing North American religious landscape. Her research at the intersection of liturgical studies and sociology of religion employs qualitative methods that highlight everyday religious experience. Commitments to interrogating the relationship between liturgy and ethics and engaging ecumenically across Christian traditions ground her research, teaching, and church leadership. She is the author of Occasional Religious Practice, this one right here, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience, on which she will speak tonight, alongside multiple articles, book chapters, and edited volumes on liturgy, ecumenism, and ethics, among many other topics. Dr. Johnson is also ordained for ministry in the Mennonite Church of Canada and was appointed an honorary canon of the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa in 2025. She served as the president of the Canadian Theological Society in 2023-2024 and is an active member in the broader Canadian religious studies field. So she is truly the embodiment of the John Albert Hall collaboration in this regard. After Sarah speaks for about 35 minutes, she will be joined by the Very Reverend Jonathan Thomas for a response and conversation before we open up to a broader time of Q&A with everyone in the audience today, both in person and online. Jonathan is the rector of Christ Church Cathedral, Victoria, and dean of the Diocese of Islands and Inlets. And I really look forward to hearing the ways that Sarah's important work about occasional religious practitioners lands with Jonathan as someone who certainly witnesses firsthand the dynamics that Sarah tracks in her book, daily, weekly, monthly, maybe occasionally at the cathedral. Now please join me in welcoming Sarah Kathleen Johnson.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I have long appreciated the excellent work of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to connect with this community as well as with the Diocese of Islands and Inlets. My remarks this evening draw from my recent book, Occasional Religious Practice, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience, which was published by Oxford University Press in June 2025. The book is available through most major academic libraries as part of the Oxford Academic ebook collection. You can access it online through the University of Victoria Library Catalog. You could also purchase a copy using this 30% off discount code. Occasional Religious Practice is an interdisciplinary book in 3 parts. The first part introduces the concept of occasional religious practice, primarily engaging with sociology of religion. The second part explores occasional religious practice as selective participation in ritual systems and is situated in the discipline of religious studies and specifically ritual studies. The third part makes a case for doing theology with occasional practitioners and explores the lived religion or lived theology of occasional practitioners in dialogue with theological literature. My main focus this evening is part 1, as well as chapter 9. And as I reflected on what to share today, I considered how Cathedral Dean Jonathan Thomas will be part of this conversation. So I begin with a story from another cathedral. Rob Ford served as a Toronto city councillor for 16 years and as the controversial populist mayor of Toronto for 4 years, from 2010 to 2014. In 2016, at the age of 46, Ford died of cancer. An elaborate funeral at the Anglican Cathedral in downtown Toronto, the Cathedral Church of St. James, marked his passing. Supporters accompanied the funeral procession to and from the cathedral, chanting slogans and singing Amazing Grace and When All the Saints. Many prominent politicians filled the pews. Family members and others offered personal tributes to Ford before the Bishop of Toronto led a traditional Anglican funeral liturgy. Ford was not a particularly religious person. He had been married at All Saints Roman Catholic Church, and his father had been buried at Westway United Church. In a posthumous biography, his brother Doug Ford described Rob as, quote, pretty easygoing about religion overall, while acknowledging, quote, I don't know what his spiritual or religious beliefs were really. That wasn't the kind of conversation we ever got into. It seems that Ford and his family had little connection to the Anglican tradition prior to his funeral. Although the high-profile nature of Ford's funeral was exceptional, turning to religious ritual on the occasion of death is not. Participant observation, interviews with clergy, diocesan statistics, and common knowledge suggest it represents patterns present in many Anglican parishes in Toronto. Quantitative data indicates these patterns are widespread in Canada. International comparison points to parallels in Europe and the United States. Indeed, what I call occasional religious practice may be the dominant way people relate to Christianity in Canada and much of the global north in the 21st century. Occasional religious practice is a way of relating to religion that is defined by participation in religious practices occasionally rather than routinely, usually in connection with certain types of occasions. Understanding occasional religious practice is part of understanding the nature and role of religion in a North American religious landscape characterized by declining participation in religious institutions, increasing uncertainty about matters of faith, and a growing proportion of the population who identify as non-religious. I introduce and develop the concept of occasional religious practice drawing on 3 years of ethnographic research. This is interdisciplinary research at the intersection of sociology of religion and liturgical studies. I conducted fieldwork in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, including 61 interviews, 41 with participants in baptisms and funerals, and 20 with Anglican clergy. I also observed more than 80 Anglican liturgies in a diversity of communities. I am very grateful to the clergy and participants who supported this research. Their stories are the foundation of a robust and nuanced concept of occasional religious practice. Occasional religious practice is defined in contrast to routine religious practice. There are also those who are more intensive in their practice, and there is the possibility of never participating in religious practices. These are relative categories that are defined contextually and may change over time. 4 types of occasions are associated with occasional religious practice: holidays, life transitions, crises, and incidental circumstances. Holidays are important to occasional practitioners. Christmas and Easter are mentioned with remarkable consistency in interviews. Life transitions are also central for many occasional practitioners, including birth, marriage, and death. This evening, I will focus especially on funerals. Times of personal or communal crisis are an occasion for religious practice. Crisis may intersect with life transition. It may also involve natural or human-caused disasters, medical diagnoses or accidents, or more subtle struggles. Finally, incidental circumstances, such as attending evensong as a tourist or providing transportation to an aging parent, may be occasions for religious practice. Participation in corporate worship is the most obvious form of occasional religious practice and is the focus of this study. However, participation in any recognizably religious practice would qualify. The concept of occasional religious practice is anchored in definitions of religion that prioritize practice, such as theories proposed by Martin Riesbrodt and Christian Smith. Religion in this context is not about affiliation, belief, or function. It is about observable participation in a meaningful system of concrete, institutionally or culturally prescribed practices. Occasional practitioners can be considered occasionally religious regardless of their affiliation, their beliefs, their reasons for practicing, or their attitudes and experiences while practicing. And they are extremely diverse in all of these ways. Participants in this research described their religious identities in many different ways. All of them were present at Anglican baptisms or funerals, among other occasions for Christian worship. Of course, some participants in Anglican practices do identify as Anglican, whether because of past or present belief and practice, or cultural heritage and family background, or personal choice. Many participants claim Anglican identity apart from routine practice. Some participants in Anglican practices affiliate with other expressions of Christianity, such as Roman Catholicism, and understand their religious identities in a similar range of ways. Some participants identify simply as Christian. Conservative Protestants may identify as Christian as a theological statement. More often, Christian is either a primary category of identification among racialized Canadians or a default category among white Canadians. Occasional participants in Christian practices may identify with non-Christian religious traditions. Sometimes this is visible in the worship space. Occasional practitioners may also claim a range of non-religious identities. They may identify as spiritual, to indicate a sense of spiritual connection in their lives, or to point to participation in alternative spiritual practices, or simply to suggest that they are non-religious but not anti-religious. Some occasional practitioners identify as atheist or agnostic or are indifferent to religion. Attention to occasional religious practice reveals that this is the eclectic mixture of participants in Christian worship in the Anglican tradition in Toronto. With this tremendous diversity present in the room, it is unsurprising that there are diverse motivations for occasional participation. I develop a taxonomy of types of occasional practitioners. These types are associated with situational roles and motivations, not stable identity categories. Occasional practitioners include initiators who bring about the practice. For example, a daughter who plans her mother's funeral, or a grandfather who decides the family is going to church together on Christmas Eve. Initiators may be motivated by cultural heritage, a strong sense of Italian Catholic identity, for instance. They may be motivated by a specific relational connection to a friend, a family member, or even a clergy person. Some may be motivated by a desire for spiritual connection, space for reflection, or to express gratitude. Initiators may also be invisibly routine, meaning they practice privately but not publicly, and therefore appear occasional. Very few of the occasional practitioners I interviewed were invisibly routine. In addition, there are also those who are involuntarily occasional, meaning they desire to practice routinely, but barriers beyond their control prevent them from doing so, such as depending on others for transportation. Occasional practice is not always a choice. In contrast to initiators, some occasional practitioners are supporters. Advocates encourage a practice without being in the position to initiate it. For example, a grandparent who advocates for the baptism of a grandchild. Inner circle supporters may have central roles, such as making faith commitments alongside their partner on behalf of their child or offering a eulogy, despite having little personal investment in the practice. Outer circle supporters tend not to have leadership responsibilities, like a coworker or a second cousin at a funeral. Catalysts include the infant being baptized and the deceased. They bring about the practice, but can neither directly initiate nor support it. Occasional practice is shaped by complex motivations and circumstances. These motivations are personal and social, spiritual and cultural, although these dimensions of human experience are often difficult to differentiate. Each type of occasional practice is substantial. None of these types of occasional religious practice can be easily dismissed. These practices are meaningful and purposeful for participants. It is inaccurate and unhelpful to assume that legitimate religious participation consists primarily of individual cognitive assent and routine or intensive participation. Occasional practice, in its diversity, is a significant and very ordinary way of relating to religion. Occasional religious practice is not a new phenomenon, as I explore in this book and elsewhere. However, it is widespread in contemporary contexts. What I am calling occasional religious practice is a common thread that runs through literature on religious change in Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, and Australia. For example, based on national survey data, Reginald Bibby claims 44% of Canadians are, quote, low religious, those in the religious middle who neither embrace nor reject religion. Bibby describes this population primarily in terms of occasional ritual participation. The so-called low religious are the dominant group in every region, age, and gender category in Canada. Bibby notes that many want to have religious funerals or burials. In this survey, 41% of Canadians prefer a religious funeral, which intriguingly includes 34% of those in the religious middle and 7% of Canadians who reject religion. Brian Clark and Stuart MacDonald likewise observed this pattern in their quantitative study of religious change in Canada since 1945. They use the term soft de-churched to describe those who identify with a Christian tradition and attend occasional rather than ordinary church services. Each of these analyses of the contemporary religious landscape points to a complex religious middle ground. While there are certainly those at the extremes of religion and non-religion, many more Canadians exist somewhere in between. Occasional practice is an important characteristic of this middle ground, although some occasional practitioners can also be found at the edges. In this literature, occasional religious practice is usually grouped with other measures and markers of religion, such as affiliation and belief, to create broader categories. My introduction and development of the concept of occasional religious practice as a way of relating to religion in its own right contributes to this conversation in several ways. First, it highlights the widespread nature of occasional religious practice as what may be one of the dominant ways people relate to religion in the global north today. Second, a focus on occasional practice apart from other dimensions of religion reveals the internal diversity of occasional practitioners. Not all occasional practitioners are nominally religious or vicariously religious or spiritual but non-religious or non-religious, but it is likely that some relate to religion in each of these ways. Third, occasional religious practice aspires to be value-neutral terminology. It aims to avoid presenting occasional religious practice as somehow irregular, low, fuzzy, fringe, or marginal. It aims to avoid language that is critical of occasional practitioners, dismissing this way of relating to religion as nominal, cultural, or soft. This theory aspires to honor occasional religious practice as a legitimate and substantial way of being religious. It aims to acknowledge and engage occasional religious practice as a phenomenon in itself on its own terms. Fourth, attention to occasional religious practice invites analysis of religious practices themselves, which is where I turn my attention in the second part of the book. And fifth, taking occasional religious practice seriously raises theoretical and empirical questions about occasional practitioners. While there is ample literature that gestures toward occasional practice, there is very little that delves deeply into how occasional practitioners understand and experience this way of relating to religion, or the religious practices in which they participate, which is what I will explore now. My focus throughout the book is not changing the way people relate to religion, but on the mutual learning that can occur among people who relate to religion in different ways. To this end, I analyzed the qualitative data for themes that are central to the liturgical experience of the occasional practitioners in this research. These themes are not intended to represent the experience of occasional practitioners beyond the immediate context of this case study of participants in Anglican practices in Toronto. They are, however, deep currents that flow through this data. While theologians might encounter this as lived theology, religious studies scholars might appreciate it as lived religion. Themes include the importance of material more than linguistic content, emotional experience as more significant than conceptual content, and religious practice approached as corporate and relational more than individual and personal. These themes challenge a modern individual Protestant bias in religious studies and in religious institutions toward considering personal belief in verbalized concepts as the measure of authentic or even permissible practice. As you will see in the examples that I share, which focus on funerals, these three aspects of liturgical experience, the material, emotional, and relational, are interconnected for many participants. Occasional practitioners speak more frequently and more passionately about the material dimensions of their liturgical experience than they do about the linguistic aspects of Christian worship. In fact, they rarely reference spoken words, especially scripted liturgical texts, and they often struggle with technical terminology and theological language. In contrast, they speak eloquently about the materiality of religious practices. Three examples of this material focus are architectural space, clothing, and objects. The architectural space of church buildings is important to occasional practitioners in Anglican practices in Toronto. Echoing existing research, some experience this sacred space of church buildings as a place to connect with the divine and to anchor individual identity. When I choose that it's time to go connect, where I feel I can do that is physically going into a church. The church building holds a lot of memories for me. My parents are buried there. I know other people who are buried there. As this example shows, experiences of sacred space are often intertwined with human relationships, both real and imagined. For some participants in interviews, liturgical space is connected to specific personal relationships. One occasional practitioner describes how she attended church services with her deceased father and the poignancy of returning to the church building and specifically their pew following his death. After my dad passed away, there were a couple of people that he was kind of close with at the church, and they said to me, "You know, when you come back, you can sit with us." And I thought that was really nice, but I was like, they sit on the other side of the church. That's not where I sit. I have to sit in our spot. Speaking of this space, and specifically this pew, is the only time this participant cried during a 2-hour interview about her father's funeral. In addition, numerous participants speak of how liturgical space connects them to a historic community. The building links them to people who have cared for and worshiped in the space across time. It's like that connection to something that's older than you and bigger than you. Something about the building just makes you feel that. In addition to where they go, occasional practitioners also reflect on what they wear. Clothing is a surprisingly frequent topic of conversation. Even in brief descriptions of occasional participation, clothing is often mentioned. As one participant observed in relation to her own comments, this conversation went from religion to fashion very quickly. Although clothing worn at the Anglican liturgies that are the subject of this study ranges widely in level of formality, some participants describe an appreciation for dressing up for church. On the day of the funeral, we were all dressed up, which was nice because some people don't dress for church anymore. It was nice to be able to have an occasion. Others resist dressing up, either personally or because it involves getting children dressed up. It's stressful getting to church for 10 o'clock with 5 children, getting tights on 2 kids, figuring out what I'm going to wear. Participants often discuss the clothing worn by catalysts specifically, especially clothing worn while being baptized, but also clothing worn in open caskets. My husband said to the kids, "Anything happens to me, I want to be laid out in my Leafs sweater. I'm telling you guys because your mother will make me wear a suit." When he died, I said to the kids, "Well, you better go and find your dad's Leafs sweater because you know what the instructions are." We did that. He wore his shirt and tie, but he had his Leafs sweater on instead of the suit jacket. Clothing is one aspect of religious practice that participants have the opportunity to influence. Even those who are not routinely involved or contributing to liturgical leadership can choose how they embody the ritual through their choice of what to wear, setting this event apart, personalizing the experience, and strengthening relationships. Other material objects may also be significant. In connection with funerals, important objects include the casket or urn, flowers, photographs, memorabilia, and gravestones. The specific objects selected often carry meaning, such as the pall made of a family tartan, or tropical flowers chosen for a woman with Jamaican heritage. Food is also significant. Months later, some participants describe the menu for the meal in more detail than the events of the funeral liturgy. Initiators and inner circle supporters often navigate a range of detailed decisions associated with the materiality of death, including questions related to space, clothing, and objects. They do so on short notice with little experience in such matters, and this becomes central to many participants' experience of a funeral. As we can already see from these examples, the materiality of the event is linked to the emotional experience. This includes the overall mood. Mood, the atmosphere, feeling, tone, spirit of an experience is a particularly difficult dimension of religious ritual to capture. At the same time, reflections on mood run through this research. Participants often convey mood through words like beauty, comfort, solemn, serious, mystery, dignity, and peace. Likely due to how participants were selected for this research, most describe the mood of the events that are the focus of our conversation in largely positive terms, even in the case of funerals. In addition to describing the overall mood of an event, participants often describe fleeting moments they consider especially significant because they are associated with certain emotions. These moments may contribute to the overall mood and may be characterized by grief or delight. For example, a woman describes the amazing calmness that came over her as she walked into the church prepared to offer her husband's eulogy. A daughter describes the surprise, the significance of singing a hymn at her mother's funeral. The funeral was 100% about the people. Okay, maybe 3% about that first hymn, which was fun to sing. Fun, that's the wrong word. It was very comforting to sing a hymn that my mother liked, and it was about nature. And I knew a lot of people at the funeral were nature lovers, and that would mean a lot to them. So it was like a connection point. These emotional moments often point to the relational character of liturgical experience for occasional practitioners. We see this in how occasional practitioners speak about funerals. In interviews, when I invite participants to reflect on what makes for a good funeral, relationships are central. This includes the importance of people gathering together and doing so in significant number. A good turnout of people shows that this person was well-loved, well-known in the community. We hear very simple stuff about, the passages of life and the next step is death, and it's nothing to be afraid of. These are things we all know, but when you hear them as a group, it resonates more deeply. This gathering includes hearing formal eulogies and informal stories, especially from close family members and friends of the deceased. It's good when people that really knew the person can get up and speak. It can be a 6-year-old saying how much they're going to miss their grandfather. Related to this, participants highly value when there's a meaningful personal connection between the clergy person and the family. Other ways the funeral may be personalized are also significant, such as the choice of music or clothing, as already discussed, or the incorporation of additional cultural elements. Participants in this research, whether routine or occasional practitioners, understand good funerals to be relational. A good funeral reflects the life and the relationships of the deceased, and this is expressed in the people who gather, the materiality, and the emotional landscape of the event. A good funeral is not primarily about the individual personal preferences of individual participants. It is about their relationships with the deceased and the support they can offer one another. This is also the case for other liturgies. In this sense, occasional practice challenges individualistic, consumeristic notions of modern spirituality, such as Robert Bella's Sheilaism. As discussed, many Anglican occasional practitioners in Toronto understand their religious identity in relation to their cultural heritage or family background. Many are motivated to initiate religious practices occasionally because of their heritage or relational connections. Many attend liturgies and even take on active roles to support family members, friends, and acquaintances. Whether and how religious practice changes over the life course are also affected by relationships. Occasional religious practice is deeply relational. It is striking that what occasional practitioners in this research consider a good funeral contrasts with how many clergy speak about what makes for a good funeral. Clergy in this study tend to emphasize the funeral as being about God and setting the life of the deceased in the broader Christian narrative of hope anchored in the resurrection of Jesus. This sometimes leads clergy to focus on managing or minimizing requests for eulogies and personalization. This points to how it is also helpful to consider themes that are central to ritual experts, such as clergy, in addition to the themes of materiality, emotion, and relationship that are central for occasional practitioners. In the book, I consider how occasional practitioners address themes including God, tradition, and ethics. Many occasional practitioners with a broad range of religious identities affirm that there is something more, and that this something more is invested in their well-being. Many occasional practitioners also have a positive sense of tradition, connected to history, continuity, and stability. They desire to be good people, to remember their loved ones as good people, and to raise their children as good people. They see the teachings of Jesus and occasional religious participation as one resource for this. I am not suggesting that the experiences of vocational practitioners should automatically override the teachings of religious traditions or rubrics for religious rituals. I am arguing that the well-being of vocational practitioners as participants in religious rituals needs to be cared for, which includes listening deeply to their experiences. Furthermore, occasional practitioners offer valuable perspectives that need to be part of the conversation about contemporary religion. The relational, material, and emotional values of occasional practitioners often a necessary corrective to the individual, conceptual, and intellectual orientation that has been dominant in modern Protestant contexts and in the study of religion. Furthermore, interpretations of religious rituals connected to material objects, emotions, and relationships are not unique to occasional practitioners. Instead, occasional practitioners reveal ways of interpreting the significance of religious rituals in which others also engage, including routine and intensive practitioners. These forms of interpretation may simply be more visible among occasional practitioners, in part because they cannot rely on historical or systematic theological knowledge, and rely instead on other ways of knowing and communicating what matters about religious practice. This invites routine and intensive practitioners, including academic scholars of religion, to greater awareness of how these dimensions also shape our work, implicitly or explicitly. As in any dialogue across difference, there is much we can learn from one another and about ourselves through dialogue among people who relate to religion in different ways. To conclude, I argue that it is crucial to attend to occasional religious practice, to understand the contemporary religious landscape and religion as it is lived out today. It is a call to value and learn from the very ordinary religious experience of occasional religious practice. Thank you.
All right, so we will move on to this next phase where Jonathan and Sarah will have a conversation, and Jonathan will be able to reflect a little bit on what Sarah talked about this evening. So hand it over to you two.
Thanks. And I actually want to start by just saying thank you for the research, for giving form and language to what many of us practitioners live experientially and anecdotally, but mostly for eschewing all pejorative language and recognizing occasional religious practice as a valid way of interacting with religion. I actually find occasional religious practice to be quite affirming of religion. The Christmas and Easter folks are recognizing these holidays as holy days. They set them apart and act in a different way than they do at other times. And I find it really interesting that even 7% of non-religious folks want a religious ceremony for a funeral, and that people still choose, even given our well-documented failings as churches, to mark their life transitions in sacred spaces. And I think my initial question is there any insight into why? Why do they keep coming to these things? Is it the heart of religion itself, right? The very basics, religare, like this thing that binds us together, one to another and the human to God. Is it searches for meaning, belonging, hope? Do we have any insight into this?
Yes, well, thank you for, first of all, for affirming the experience of vocational religious practice as one that needs to be attended to in ways that take it seriously. I really appreciate that. In terms of the motivations for occasional participation, this is one of the common questions. In fact, when people hear that I study occasional religious practice, they often say, "Oh, you're asking people why." And I don't actually ask people directly why, because that's a question that kind of puts people in a more defensive posture. I tend to ask instead for the story of the baptism or the story of the funeral. And in the process of hearing that story, the motivations behind the practice also emerge. And the taxonomy of types of occasional practitioners is how I respond to that question of why, and the diversity of motivations that are at play. And some of them are spiritual motivations connected to some of those dynamics that you name. But a lot of them are also these relational motivations for initiators in terms of relational connections and connection to culture or heritage, and especially for the many occasional practitioners who are supporters, who are there for other people in their lives who matter to them, who might not ever have chosen to participate in that practice without the person who they're there to support.
Is there some aspect in which that's really still the very heart of religion, right? Like the care for the another, the relational aspect, the binding together in that practice, right?
Yeah, I do think that there's a real sense of deep commitment to other people that shows up in that willingness to engage, especially across difference, across discomfort, especially for those who may have had difficult experiences who re-engage in that space for the sake of others. I do think there's that sense of connectedness, and whether or not you define that as the center of religion, I think is really a question of how we define religion, which is a huge and open debate.
Are there, we are grouping occasional religious attenders as a body. Do you find large cultural differences, either generationally, geographically, that really make meaningful difference in how they participate?
Well, one of the features of this study is it is an ethnographic case study that's really deeply rooted in one place, in one context, in one moment in time, and that is shaped by the idea that studying one case really closely can reveal structures and theories and patterns we might identify in other contexts as well. So I'd say one of my great hopes for this book is that some people might pick up this concept and ask whether it's present in other cultures, in other contexts, in other religious traditions, in other geographic regions, in ways that are similar or different, likely quite different to Anglicans in Toronto in the late 2010s. So I can't say a lot about those variations based on this case study.
Turning to the practice and how we engage. You say that for many of these occasional attenders, it's not about affiliation or belief. They don't focus on the language. It's about the practice itself. But is there some stage at which we're not participating in the same ritual, right? If we don't have certain shared understandings, knowledge, we're doing the same thing. We're not doing the same thing. We're doing similar things in the same space. Or how do we create liturgies and rituals for people who don't have, in many cases, the shared background, language, knowledge? And let me give an example. The practice known as Ashes to Go. Right? On Ash Wednesday, we, in the Christian tradition, often put ashes with some baptismal oil in the shape of a cross on people's head as part of the beginning of Lent. Built in a service, we're generally reminding people of not only their mortality, but resurrection and baptism and not only their sinfulness, but forgiveness and absolution. When I served in New England, the average occasional practitioner was a lapsed Catholic. So this was actually a beautiful practice for them. We met at train stations, people commuting into New York, and they found deep meaning and connection in this. When I served in the Midwest, we had a lot of former evangelicals. And so there was some foreignness to the practice, but we shared enough language and symbol for this to be meaningful, and actually in some ways more meaningful because it was slightly foreign to them. Here, I feel like if I did this on a corner, I would be telling people that they were going to die without the inherent connection to the resurrection, because some people may not have that connection to what we're doing. And I would be telling them that they're sinners without the promise of forgiveness and absolution. And frankly, as a religious practice, that just seems banal. Right? And so it's an example of like, what level of shared knowledge, language, story does it take to bind us together and make ritual meaningful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting question. And I think that's a question that I pick up a lot more in the second part of the book, which I did not talk about at all this evening. But one of the ways I look at occasional religious practice in that portion of the book is as selective participation in a ritual system that some practice more completely. And that ritual systems theory recognizes that people interpret the meaning of a practice more often through the repetitions and experiences of opposition with other ritual systems, other ritual experiences that they've had, rather than through official teachings about what a practice means or these sort of theoretical understandings of what it's about. So even in the example that you just shared about Ashes to Go, you can see how people are interpreting this in dialogue with different ritual systems. They're receiving it because of their experience with repetitions in the Roman Catholic system or with opposition in the evangelical ritual system. And they're bringing different experiences, different meanings to the practice. And I think that's one of the richnesses, the other contexts of dialogue that emerge in relation to occasional practice is when these different ritual systems overlap in these new ways and these other dimensions of practices that may become very familiar for someone who's rooted in one tradition can be revealed through these points of connection with people who are really embedded in different ritual systems and bringing those ritual systems in dialogue with each other.
How does that dialogue work practically?
Yeah, and I think that one of the challenges of the word dialogue is it makes it sound like we're talking about ideas, right? And I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is primarily a dialogue that takes the form of talking about ideas. Now, that might be part of it. Often these kinds of practices have conversations that surround them. There's a process of preparation for a funeral or for a baptism that includes conversation between those shaping the ritual and the participants in it. But I think more often it takes place through the kinds of sharing the kinds of experiences that create more common ground, and this kind of materiality, this emotion, this relationality is part of the dialogue too. So one of the examples that I develop more in the book is the use of photography by occasional practitioners. And it's something that just sort of started showing up in interviews. I wasn't doing visual ethnography or ethnography with photography in this study, although that would have been very generative. But instead, people kept showing me pictures as a way of explaining what mattered to them about these events. And that, I think, was one way of entering into a dialogue, of saying this moment was significant because it captured something that was one of those moments that revealed to me why I was there in the first place. So finding ways to enter into dialogue that don't rely on having a shared theological language or having a lot of technical terminology, but on meeting each other in those moments when people who relate to religion in different ways are already in the same space because they're choosing to participate in the same practice.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll open up to a broader conversation. If you have questions for Sarah or Jonathan about his experience of this as well, please. So you can put up your hand and we'll have a couple mic runners because we will need the mic for the Zoom audience to actually hear the question. So please speak into the microphone. And we have a Zoom question already. Sweet, from Zoom.
This question is from Chris. He says, "Many thanks, Sarah, for this fascinating talk. Forgive me, but I'm a philosopher, so I always fear that my questions are pesky rather than helpful. I hope that's not the case here. As I was listening, I found myself stuck on one of your central terms, practice. That is, I wonder what you and your subjects take religious practice to mean. You seem to use it in a way that overlaps strongly with, quote, going to church. Is that right? In the background to this is a pesky question. You mentioned involuntarily occasional practitioners as a category, and you explained that these were people who wanted to be more than occasional, but are thwarted by circumstances. I wonder about whether this category also needs to include those who don't want to practice at all, but are forced to by partners, parents, children, etc. That is, people who don't want to practice, but who do go to church for other reasons, involuntary practitioners. On your account, are those people practicing or not?"
Yes. So many dimensions to this question. I think I'll start with the end. I think it was Chris? What Chris is describing is supporters who maybe don't want to be there. So people who are involuntarily occasional are in the initiator category. They wish that they could initiate the practice, but for reasons beyond their control, they're unable to do so. So the most common instance here would be questions of disability, especially people who are aging, who wish that they could practice routinely and are not able to do so. So because it's in the initiator category, there is more of a sense of desire to initiate. Whereas those who are showing up for someone else, regardless of the level of duress, are still supporters in this framework. And in terms of the larger question of what is a practice, I definitely am focusing primarily on public Christian worship, and that's in large part shaped by the case study that I'm engaging here. Other practices show up, especially for those who are invisibly routine. So for example, praying with children before bed is an invisibly routine practice. People in this research may engage in that practice every night, but they appear occasional because they're only visible in a community every once in a while. So there's that potential for other practices to be considered here. And I especially think if this concept was taken into other religious traditions, other cultural contexts, a wide array of other forms of practice could emerge.
Other questions? Yeah, John Totominal right here.
This might be pesky too, continuing a theme. Because of the centrality of practice in how you spoke, it occurs to me that, and I strongly agree, religion is what we do primarily, and not so much what we think or believe explicitly anyway. So there are questions about what may be implicit in practices, which can or cannot be teased out depending on circumstances and the nature of the conversation. But if we focus on practices, we then get into a really difficult challenge of figuring out which of our practices count as religious. I am of the opinion that purchasing of all kinds or shopping, it's the primary practice of capitalist life. And how many of us establish our sense of worth, what we can afford to buy, what we cannot afford to buy. So there are deep questions of identity, of longing, of desire, what can be had, what cannot be had. So this raises the question, which of us is not engaged in religious practice? You see why it's a pesky question.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think it is related to this broader question that already showed up in terms of how we define religion at all. And I'm not someone who is committed to universal definitions of religion. I'm interested in definitions of religion that are useful for addressing specific questions. And in the context of this research, I find the practice-based definitions of religion that are introduced by Martin Riesbrout and Christian Smith to be particularly helpful for exploring the question of occasional religious practice, but also for bringing my two primary disciplines in dialogue with each other, sociology of religion and liturgical studies. Because those definitions that focus on religion as practices that relate to superhuman powers that are culturally or institutionally prescribed create a framework that allows us to explore some really pervasive and important contemporary dynamics. So that's how I approach the question of defining what is considered a religious practice in the context of this research. When I'm talking about Anglicans in Toronto, I think there's generally a sense of agreement that this is a religious tradition. So in the context of this case study, it's less of a practical question. I think it gets a little bit more slippery if this concept was applied to things that are in more of a gray area in terms of whether or not they're considered religion.
Yeah, Peter.
Thank you very much for your research. In one of my side hustles as a Unitarian lay chaplain, I meet people who want to be married or buried. I usually don't meet the buried people. But I discuss with the families, what do you want and what does this mean to you? And what I often find is people who have a religious background, usually grandparents, but their Sunday school was felt animals and felt ark and little felt Jesus on the felt board. And they have limited understanding of what they were doing in church when they were little kids. And so much of that is gone. And I wonder, it saddens me in a way that the occasional religious practitioners, of whom I know many, they're not actually even sure what's going on with the ashes. They're not sure, well, why is that person walking ahead of that other person and why those robes? They see the beauty in it, but they don't know the why. And I wonder if the occasional religious practitioner, if there's a way for dialogue to help them move to the next step, to understand why this is happening and why this procedure, why Easter. I've met nominal Christians in Victoria who aren't really sure about how important Easter is compared to Christmas. And I wonder if you stumbled across any of that in your research.
Yes, well, I think it gets at a deeper question too, which is who determines the meaning of a ritual practice? And there are certainly official church teachings around some of these practices. There are historically significant interpretations that have passed on through traditions. And I think that's one part of the dialogue. But another part of the dialogue is also the interpretations that occasional practitioners bring, drawing on repetitions that may be in very different ritual systems. So I'm curious about what can emerge at that intersection, and it doesn't mean that only one of those voices is present. It's how are those different interpretations of the same practice put in conversation or engaged with each other in different ways. And I'd love to hear more at some point about Unitarian contexts around these practices. I have done some research within the Unitarian Universalist tradition as a context where theistic diversity, the kind of diversity in the room, is on the surface. It's just very, very explicit and overt that people have a range of religious affiliations, whereas in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, there's a tendency to assume, well, of course everyone here is Anglican, whereas there's actually that diversity happening that's much more explicit in a UU space. So I find Unitarian Universalism is a really helpful context for exploring some of these questions about the diversity that is present in the context of religious practices.
Another question here, Andrea.
Hi, I just wanted to I hope I can work it into a question. But I know you're an academic. You can find a question in it, and certainly a response. But I wanted to say something that wasn't pesky, partly because I expected this to be a good talk, and it was. But I hadn't expected it to be moving and powerful. And I think that's because you pulled us out of ourselves. And that was one of the themes that emerged in your, I guess, a very partial, summary of the book. But that people talked about things that, ways in which they stepped outside of their everyday life. And so one of the main themes here, to me, it seemed, was space and connection. And I was thinking a very transformative moment in my life was the memorial for my former PhD supervisor, in which I noticed I was one of the people giving a eulogy, and I noticed usually when you speak in public, you're thinking about your talk and you're distracted until you've given it. And I was surprised because I listened to other people's eulogies, and I wept and I laughed because I was in the moment, which hardly ever happens because most of the time we're shopping or whatever. And so some of Sarah's points, some of the snippets you had from your interviews were really interesting because you talked about how things seem more numinous or real or resonant when people hear them together. I think something like that. Maybe I'm getting that a little wrong. But I think most of the time you can tell yourself you're not going to die, or your loved ones won't die, because you're not forced to step outside of your routine. And I think that that's the space that you're talking about. So I'm not sure that that's a question, but you made me really think about the big questions. And it sounds like, and I just, one more thing, I really am impressed by the way you asked those questions of your interviewees. You didn't say, why don't you go to church more often? Or why, you wanted them to open up, and that really came across.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. I think what you're referring to is actually one of the quotes from one of the occasional practitioners who named how some familiar things may sound different when they're spoken in a group on those contexts. I think that's the kind of thing that can be shared when that space for sharing stories and sharing what's significant about these kinds of experiences open up. I think that's also what's one of the things that's so significant about taking a specific baptism or a specific funeral as a starting point for these conversations, is that it's an event that the person who I'm speaking with is really invested in, even if it's their only occasion when they have been in connection with a religious practice. They're open to talking about it, sometimes at quite a great length, because they really care about it. And it's a way to find that common ground, to have that kind of dialogue. And it's certainly very moving for me at times as the person in that conversation with them. So my hope is to share some of those stories and some of the insights that I've received from them.
Great, yeah, Matt.
Yes, so another potentially pesky question coming at you.
Please, my CSRS crew, come on.
So I was very intrigued by your opening hook featuring Rob Ford. And while it might be me channeling my own antipathies towards Rob Ford and his brother's political policies, if I was to venture a guess, I might say, possibly, although I don't know, that part of his motivation, based on the anecdotes that you gave in having the ceremony where he did, may have had to do with social or cultural capital, may have had to do with clout, these sorts of things. And that type of motivation is not something you're likely or very easily to get out of people when you're interviewing them. So I'm wondering if you accounted for some of those possible motivations, and if not, how you might think about that.
Yes, yeah, good question. Sadly, I was not able to interview the Ford family as part of this research. That anecdote is drawing on archival work, which was also part of this. So, and the cathedral in Toronto has truly remarkable archives of events like that. In general, in these interviews, I found that people were very honest about their motivations, and were not telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. And in these encounters, I think it was important that I'm not an Anglican clergy person, that I'm not Anglican, that I'm not representing the church in that space, that it's a confidential conversation. And it wasn't the same kind of interaction that can sometimes happen when people are seeking these practices and are trying to communicate what they hope will generate a positive response. So I think a willingness to talk about at least the things they were willing to admit to themselves in terms of their motivations was pretty high. If there are other motivations that were at play, questions related to status or social capital, or kind of the significance of something being at the cathedral, for example, I think it's if they're acknowledging those things to themselves, they might also acknowledge them in an interview. Of course, I can't say that for sure.
I think we have a question with Jess, and then we'll come down here.
Thank you, Sarah. I really liked how this work gets us thinking about kind of the negative space, if you will, in religious studies, where there's always something we focus on, but what's around it. And so I was really thinking about this idea of, well, what are people relying on to understand a liturgy, for instance? And so then I want to ask you, how has this research impacted your own work or choices as a liturgist?
Yes, yeah, very, very interesting question. There are so many contexts. I'd say it certainly shapes the kind of teaching that I do as a liturgist in Anglican spaces, in other mainline Protestant spaces and Roman Catholic spaces. I'm really looking forward to being with the clergy of this diocese tomorrow and having some of those more theological and ministry-focused conversations. So maybe I'll just leave it there for now and say we'll talk more.
Yeah, right here.
I'm hoping that my question won't be pesky, but I can't guarantee that. What I'm wondering is, because you've picked a quite defined population, which is good for studying, but it is also one that is inherently quite liturgical. In other words, it has, a defined way of worship, oftentimes very prescribed language, right? So I'm just wondering, and again, forgive me if this is going to be pesky or not, but I'm just wondering, based upon your research or anything that you've done in other than for this book, perhaps, can you speculate how much, what kind of findings you might get from another tradition, like an evangelical tradition, one where that liturgical content is much less emphasized or much less prevalent, in fact. So I'm just, scientist wants to know, what's your speculation?
Yes, well, it is speculation. I haven't done that qualitative research, of course, although I do also study liturgical practices in free church traditions. So that is within the kind of research that I do. And I do think there is variation in that space. I actually had an author meets critics panel at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and Gerardo Marti was on that panel and has done a lot of work in mega churches and evangelical contexts, and was making some very different connections to how occasional practice functions in spaces that are kind of very explicitly evangelistic and expect to have a very high number of visitors, and how that might play out in a different way than in the Anglican tradition. Another difference that comes to mind is one of the dynamics that initially surprised me in this research is how often I was speaking with people who come from a Catholic background, who were choosing to participate in Anglican practices on certain occasions. There are, of course, demographic reasons for that, with Catholicism being the largest tradition in Toronto and in Canada, public Catholic school system, there's a lot going on there. But I think it's also that ritual familiarity and the way that Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems overlap that allows for a certain fluidity between those traditions that would probably be very different in an evangelical space, free church space.
We're almost at the hour, but I know that William has a question here, and also Terry. So Molly, if we can so we'll have quick questions, and Sarah can respond to both of them.
Well, it might actually be quick, because I think it actually ties well into the last question, but maybe the opposite. Rather than speculating about how far the analytic can work outside of the Anglican tradition, I'm actually curious more about the Anglicanness of your analytic. You're proposing that occasional practice is not only worth looking at because it's normal, but because it's valid. And I can understand from a religious studies perspective how that might make sense. You know, we as religious studies scholars need to take these people seriously and not dismiss them and kind of focus on the presumed ideal type routine practitioner. But, you know, is it the role of the religious studies scholar to determine what counts as valid religious practice? And I ask that because in the context of at least one other religious tradition I'm familiar with, me going out and asserting that occasional religious practice in that context is valid would be pushed back at. It would be considered not valid. And it would be really weird for me to go and kind of push that narrative. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think I could have come up with this analytic in my own research context, but you did within yours. So I'm curious, what about Anglicanism allowed this analytic to kind of emerge in your brain?
Let's tag on Terry's question and we'll answer both.
Yes, I was wondering, since within Christianity, all parts of Christianity, community, being a member of a community is really the essence of practice. Were the people you interviewed conscious of the fact that they're not in a community, or did they have a sense of community but didn't choose to participate within that community? And another question relates to age. What was the age range? Was there a difference in attitude with respect to the age of the participants?
Great. So what is Anglican about it? And age and community. Go for it.
Yes. Well, I think I'll start with the age question, since that's the easy one. The participants in this study range quite a bit in age. They're all adults. I don't interview younger people below 18 in this study. And there are generational differences, the same kinds of patterns that we see in terms of generational religious change in Canada and across the global north are evident kind of at the micro level in this research, with each generation being less religious than the preceding generation in measures of affiliation, belief, and practice. And in terms of belonging in community, there's a huge amount of variation there, as we would expect when there's so much diversity among occasional practitioners. Some may identify very, very strongly with a specific parish, even if they're there once a decade. And so there can be sometimes tensions between who leaders in a community see as part of that community and how individuals understand themselves in relation to a community. And in terms of the Anglicanness of this study, there are a variety of reasons why I chose to do this research in the Anglican tradition. One is that it is a tradition that understands its identity, especially as closely tied to practice. It's also a tradition that has some significant parallels across a very broad spectrum of the Christian tradition, which creates, I think, a concept that can apply more broadly than if it was based in only a tradition that's less prone to make connections to the Catholic tradition, to other forms of mainline Protestantism, to evangelical Anglicanism. So it had a kind of internal diversity that was helpful for me. But at the same time, as I've mentioned, my hope is that people will test this out and see how it's similar or different in other settings too. So I'm curious what you would see in your context in terms of occasional religious practice. And in terms of the question of value, when I subtitled the book, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience, there are two dimensions to that for me. One is a theological claim. I am a theologian as well as a religious studies scholar, and this is a book that does make normative theological claims, especially in part 3, and I'll be talking more about that tomorrow too. But from a religious studies perspective, it's also saying we need to start paying attention to occasional religious practice, paying attention to the religious middle. Stop writing this out of survey questions, but instead asking about it and noticing how occasional religious practice is part of our religious landscape today in Canada.
All right, wonderful. So with that, please let us thank Sarah and Jonathan for this evening.